Good afternoon, everyone. Well, sorry. Good afternoon for me. Good morning for you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much again for your interest and for your availability to be here today for our not last present, originally the last unit, but as you probably know, we will have an additional seminar, I think on Monday, the 4th of December. Yeah, I think that's the date. So in that seminar, in that last webinar, we will together, Ivan Gonzalez, Alberto, and yours truly to present an exercise, right? A practical exercise about a simulation using using a sample of individuals, and the idea is to review all the concepts and the equations we have been studied over the last weeks, so you can have a better sense of what the microsimulation means in practice, right? So as for today, this will be a very very short presentation. I think, given that we will hold this additional webinar, you can better understand the concepts and measures in that session, and we can address a lot of concerns and questions. For today, today will be an overview about the other side of the microsimulation exercise, which is social expenditure and subsidies, etc. All the fiscal interventions that go from the government to the households, right? So as for the first part, what we reviewed the last week was indirect and direct taxes, which is this interaction between households and government, in which households, mainly households, pay taxes for the goods and services they purchase, they buy, and they pay also taxes and contributions for the factors they sell in the market. It could be labor, so they pay taxes for labor, for personal income, or if if households own a small business, well, they have to pay direct taxes as well for the income they generate, right? Okay, so transfers and subsidies. So this is, I mean, if the taxation part was quite complex, if we can say that. I mean, as you know, technically, the microsimulation and how to add and how to subtract the different concepts is not that difficult, right? I mean, in technical terms, in operationalizing the technique, it's not that complicated. It's just about adding and subtracting. It's pure arithmetics and programming in Excel or state, etc., etc. What is complex is to understand how the system works in terms of the multiplicity of taxes, the multiplicity of rates, and the determination of who pays those taxes. So if that understanding is quite complex and vary dramatically from place to place. This second part, which is social spending and subsidies, it's probably more complex, even more complex. Okay. It is very important to take into account social expenditure through transfers and subsidies, because these elements constitute a crucial part, a crucial share of the household income, right? So households have an income not only from labor or from non-labor sources such as remittances and donations, private donations, etc., but also as benefits from the government. So depending on the social, on the socioeconomic conditions of households and individuals, they can receive direct transfers, which is usually in the form of cash, right? So if you are, I don't know, for instance, a household is under the poverty line, which is the only criteria to receive the benefits, so probably households will be a part of the target population to receive a transfer in cash, which can be conditional on the attendance of children within the household to school, or it could be also conditional on regular health checks of the household members, or it could be the case that elderly population who are excluded from the formal pension system, they can receive non-contributory pensions, again, in cash, right? And that is not conditional, that is just to meet the requirement of being an elderly person and not having formal insurance or pensions, right? So those components are a significant share of household income. Depending on the country, they can and the size of the benefits, they can move individuals out of poverty in the short term by itself, right? So if we for instance, let me put an example. If I don't know, for instance, in Guatemala, conditional cash transfers, so that means cash that people in poverty receive from the government, conditional or unconditional, could imply an increase of their disposable income by about 30%. So that amount, it could be enough to move these beneficiaries out of poverty. So if that is the result, that is fantastic. I mean, because the government is achieving not only to move individuals out of poverty and then improving the living condition, the economic living conditions of the poor families, and families, of course, are benefiting from more resources to buy additional food, additional goods and services they need, etc., etc. But if transfers are conditional to school attendance and health checks, they have all the additional benefit of they could have the effect of accumulate human capital in the long term. So that is fantastic, right? That was the main goal of the original cash transfer schemes, right? the conditional ones. But what happens once we take into account the effect of taxes into that relationship? So if the transfer increases, I am not moving the slides, by the way, so this is just from my mouth. So if the transfer if the transfer increased the disposable income of the poor families by 30% on average, as I said, that is fantastic. Once we take into account the effect of direct taxes and indirect taxes, we can see, and this is an actual example in the case of Guatemala, that the effect on, the transfer increased, let's say 30% the disposable income of the poor individuals in Guatemala. That is not the actual figure, but let's assume that that is true. So with that increase, let's assume that poverty in Guatemala reduces by 10 percentage points, for instance, just to say something, from 40% to 30%. But once that we take into account direct and indirect taxes, that means once that we subtract from the income the direct taxes and the indirect taxes that households and individuals pay, those who are in poverty, and this is an actual result. The figures are not actual, but the result is actual. We can see that poverty, that the benefits of transfers are nullified, and we can observe that poverty even increased. So what we are giving, from the perspective of the government, what we are giving to what we are redistributing to individuals with the right hand, we are taking from individuals with the left hand through taxes, etc., etc. So that means an inconsistency in how the systems, the social and fiscal and the taxation systems are working. And it is very important to take into account both in order to have a comprehensive picture of living conditions of the population in each society, and how, by means of what we can improve those living conditions, whether through taxes or through social instruments, right? So in Guatemala, in this example, it is a dramatic result. I mean, all the effort that the government, that the social policies in Guatemala, and there are other cases, but this is quite representative. I mean, all the effort that social policies are putting in reduced poverty through cash transfer, with all the fiscal resources that implies, it's, I mean, for households and individuals, it's just bad, because for starters, they have to pay, apparently, direct taxes, which are not intended to be paid by poor individuals. I mean, the design of the direct taxation is mainly that the individuals who earn more pay more. That is, I mean, the design of the direct taxation it's a progressive tax in nature. But apparently, in that context, some individuals are paying some direct taxes. So, but in addition, for the goods and services they consume, they are paying a lot. I mean, as a share, probably, if we compare the amounts, of course, the people located at the top of the distribution, they pay a lot more. But as a proportion of their income, the poor individuals are paying a lot. So even though they receive a transfer that has the potential to increase their income, it is dramatically reduced by the by the tax system. So that is why it is important to take into account the two sides, right? So we can identify the potential, we can identify the problem, which if it is from the taxation or the transfer side, and we can identify the potential solution, the spaces for policy. So social expenditure is it's crucial in this analysis, and that's why we have to include it in the simulation, because a fiscal reform aimed at increasing the tax rate for the sale of I don't know, apples. It is the effect of that increase, of that reform. It's translated into the well-being conditions of households and individuals, and so we have to take into account both. So we can disentangle if that fiscal reform in taxes is contracted or not by the influence by the implementation of a social transfers, etc., etc. So it is very important to take into account both. So for a microsimulation, how can we take into account that, and why it is complex? Well, it depends again on having a good knowledge, a fair knowledge about how the different social instruments work in that specific context. How many programs exist, how they work, who are supposed to be the beneficiaries, what are the amounts, etc., etc. And if we can identify that in the survey, it's critical. If not, again, as in the case of the taxation side, we can put in practice some simulation or imputation techniques, so we can have the columns. Again, going back to my example of I mentioned 2 or 3 weeks ago. So if you look at the household survey, at the end, what you have are columns. I mean, you have rows of individuals and you have columns of concepts, right? So now we have the income and the different, at this point, we have the different columns indicating the amounts of taxes they pay, direct and both direct and indirect. And now we will have all the income they receive from transfers, from the conditional cash transfer flagship program, from non-contributory pensions, from I don't know, vouchers for food, etc., etc. So the idea is again to decompose all these concepts, so we can have the whole picture in our data survey, in our data set. So at the end, we can simulate the changes in any instrument, and then we can estimate the impacts of the reform, right? Okay. Of course, I forgot to mention one element which is very important from the social expenditure side. It is not only about cash transfers or vouchers to buy food or school supplies, etc., etc. It is about subsidies, right? So to help families to consume, to access to a specific service or good, and in-kind benefits, which is mainly in the form of education and health services. the provision of health and education. It is, I mean, even though it is not a benefit that households receive in cash, it is important to take into account those, because that is mainly an expending that the government I forgot the English, sorry. it's an expenditure concept that households are not covering, but it is something that it's being provided by the government. So even though it is not part of the household budget, sometimes, and in this microsimulation exercise, it is quite illustrative. Sometimes we can monetize the cost and the total cost of the provision of education and health services for each individual in the population, so we can have an idea of how, if monetized, how, for instance, the distribution of income could be, right? So if we can say that I don't know, the level of inequality in a given society is very high. I don't know, a Gini coefficient of 50%, right? Just by using the income reported, non-labor and labor income, etc., and cash transfer, etc., all the disposable income for individuals. But what if we take into account the services they access from the government, which is mainly education and probably housing and health services? Given that those are services that they are not paying for in terms that they are not deducting from their income, we can take about those concepts as part of their disposable income. So if we monetize those services and we measure inequality, we can capture at some extent the effect on inequality by monetizing those services, right? We cannot do the same with poverty, because I mean we have to include the cost of those services in the poverty line, and that is not correct. But at least for inequality, for how the distribution of income could be changed, especially if those services are particularly targeted to the lower end of the distribution, the bottom of the population at the bottom of the distribution, we can say something about the pro-poor character of the social spending, right? So it is also important to take into account that. Okay. So in implementing our microsimulation, again, we have to, as I said before, it is just about disentangling the different concepts, and it requires a good knowledge about the systems, the policies, the instruments from the social expenditure side that are in practice in that moment in that specific context. So we have to know who are receiving the benefits and what are the requirements. And this brings us with this slide, which is the usual dilemma that we have to deal with transfers from the perspective of the policymaker. I mean, and also from the perspective of the practitioner who will implement the microsimulation. in order to understand this. Who should receive transfers? That is a basic question. Who in the population? It is just only the poor population. So if it is only the poor population, I mean that is quite straightforward, because I don't know. Let's mention again the case of I don't know, Guatemala, for instance, which is a country where with a poverty rate of about 45 or 50% of the population. So a lot of populations are living under the poverty line. So if we are about to design a social transfer, a cash transfer for the population, and we say that, okay, let's target this transfer to all the poor population. So it is just about one requirement, which is being poor, right? So we can cover a lot of populations. If we measure the size of the population in this axis, in this vertical axis. In this horizontal axis, we are talking about the requirements to be considered as a beneficiary of the transfer. So, okay, but then the government will face a restriction, which is a budgetary restriction. Okay, this transfer, it's a good idea to be received to benefit all the poor population. But given that the poor population is 50% of the total population, it implies a lot of resources. So we should think about additional requirements. So let's say, okay, so it could be the poor population, which is the only requirement here, plus the addition to be female-headed households. So that's a second requirement, and therefore that reduces the size of the beneficiary population to be just like this. In terms of the total population, probably it's not the 50%, but it could mean that now probably it will reduce from 50% to, I don't know, 30%, right? Okay. That's because the resources, the fiscal resources there are restrictions regarding the amount. So, okay, so that's a lot. Still, that's a lot. So how about, okay, they are poor, they are female-headed households, and let's say that these households have to be these households have to be composed by at least two children, right? So that's a third requirement, and by adding a third requirement, we will have an even lower share of the population who will be considered as beneficiary, right? So the decision about who will receive the transfer and whether the requirement, it is not straightforward, and it requires, and it depends on the social conditions of the country. It depends on the magnitude of the privations. It depends of the magnitude of poverty, and it depends, of course, of the available resources, right? So, in implementing the microsimulation, we will find a lot from country to country. I mean, we will find a lot of possibilities in terms of programs and policies put in place. So we have to understand who are receiving the benefits and what are the requirements. And this is important, as I said at the beginning, not only for the policy maker who has to decide what are the requirements to achieve a target population, but also from the perspective of the consultant who is implementing the microsimulation. It's very important to understand what are the requirements, because he or she has to simulate or to impute the amounts for each program implemented in that country at that specific moment, when the information is not reported on the household service. So the consultant has to explore external information, national accounts, administrative records, all the laws and the requirements to simulate or to impute the amounts that corresponds to the potential beneficiaries in the household dataset, right? I'm not sure if I explained it myself, but in the absence of specific information about who is a beneficiary and what are the amounts and what make individuals to be sorry. If you open again your data set and you find that the population is reporting a total amount of transfers, but nothing more, it is important for you to understand what are the social policies in practice implemented at that moment, what are the requirements, and what are the amounts. So you can, based on those information, which is usually external, you can disentangle the total amount reported in the survey into, or decompose the total amount into the different policies based on the legal requirements and on who is the target population. Okay, so this is a very important figure, a very important graph for both, for the policymaker, which probably among you, many of you are policymakers here, and you know a lot about this. But also, if you are more interested in the implementation of a microsimulation exercise, it is important for you to bear in mind this basic scheme. Okay, so technically, how to add and subtract the different transfers and subsidies. Let me drop this word because this is incorrect. This is just about transfers and subsidies. So, as we reviewed the last week or two sessions ago, it is just about identities, right? So microsimulation, it's just about identities. It's about adding.
Eduardo.
Yes. See? Yes. Ivan? Hello?
Eduardo, I think we are having some difficulties to hear what you're saying in the last 1 minute or so. If you could repeat, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Doreen says that she's okay with sound. Probably it was only me. Sorry. So go ahead.
Okay, no, but how about the rest of you?
Yes,
Yeah, it's
very clear.
okay. Okay, so
Yes, we
Thank you.
we listen to you. We
Go
listen
ahead.
to you.
okay, okay. Okay, as for this slide, I mean, this is again basic, very basic identity. Is just to formalize what the technicalities in the microsimulation exercise, right? So similarly to what we review in last week, which is how the different taxes works depending on the quantities, etc., etc. It is just the same. I mean, the complex part of this microsimulation is this, right? To properly understand how the laws, what are the rules, and how the amounts of the target population works in that country and at some specific moment. Once we have understood the previous aspect, this is just adding and subtracting. So, for instance, this first equation, let's think about it as a subsidy, where X is the quantity consumed by the household, consumed of a specific good or service. Let's say electricity. So the amount of electricity consumed by household. P is the price, and S is the subsidy. So this is just a way to express or to formalize the equation. Price minus the subsidy times the quantity consumed, which sometimes can be expressed in kilowatts, I don't know. So that is the amount that that this household should should pay for electricity, right? So so that's how we can express that that situation. There could be some different situations in which the household is consuming some specific quantity here times the price, and the subsidy, this part, it's allocated by the government as a share. So 1 minus some share of the price, it's being subsidized from the government. So let's think about transportation, right? So households consume, I don't know, an X quantity, let's say 3 rides per week at this price, which is the market price, but this will be discounted by a factor of this size, which is a share of the subsidy. That means the government will pay some share of the ticket for each ride. I don't know. And this, another identity, just simply describes a direct transfer, right? So if this is the amount of the disposable income of each household, which is considered or identified as a potential beneficiary of a cash transfer, for instance, so we just simply have to add the amount of the transfer. So at the end, we will have a total amount, which is the income plus the transfer, as it is shown here, right? So this is just mere technicalities. And of course, I don't know how to erase all these lines. I'm not sure if that is possible, Ivan Rueda, because probably I am just covered in black all the equations. So I don't know. Let me check. Okay, yes, delete all annotations. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so all of these situations, of course, apply to different households, right? So this one could apply to a poor, to a household living under the poverty line, right? So this is a household which meets the criteria. So it is under the poverty line. It is a female-headed household with 3 children, etc., living in a rural area of the country. So this condition apply for that household. This another condition could apply to this household, which is not necessarily poor, but it is in a near poverty situation. So this household require the support from the government, so this household can cover its expenditure on transportation or I don't know. And this another household could be the case that it is not poor, it is not even near poor household, but it is a quite vulnerable household which owns a very small business. So this household probably could be greatly benefited from a subsidy of I don't know, the consumption of electricity. So this household can produce more. I don't know. So these are, I mean, the rationale, it's important, but the technicality, it's very straightforward, which, as I said, which is important to understand and to have very clear is this relationship, so we can disentangle what types of households here we have. So depending on the household, we will apply the different benefits according to all of any of these identities, right? So I think I mentioned quite a lot about subsidies. They are usually targeted to vulnerable population with the purpose of supporting their economic activity or to help households to smooth the consumption of households. I think I referred as well to the importance of in-kind transfers, and I think that you will understand more how the different concepts of social expenditure work in our last webinar, when we will show the practical exercise, right, from the beginning to the final stage, when we measure, we will be measuring the effects of a potential reform on inequality, at least on inequality and probably, yes, on poverty. I would like to make a final note on poverty measurement. Why? For 2 main reasons. The first one is that from the very beginning we have been talking about impacts and effects of fiscal reforms, of changes in fiscal instruments, their effect on poverty. And we have assumed that poverty is just a given, already measured phenomena, right? And we have assumed that you know how to measure poverty. And we thought that this is a mistake, right? So we would like to present some very basic ideas about poverty measurement. And the second reason is that in the exercise of this 6th unit, you will be asked to measure poverty. So it is important. So, and actually there is an additional reason, a third reason. When we were discussing about asking you to measure poverty in that exercise, and of course we will review this in the practical exercise, I think it is important to give the first step on poverty measurement, because it could be a good idea probably in the future, probably next year, or I don't know. It is something that we have to discuss. It could be a good idea to have actually a virtual course on poverty measurement, both from the perspective of incomes, but also the multidimensional poverty, including the different approaches, the different measures, the different indices, etc., no? And their implications, of course. So let's think about this as just as a starting point, and this is very, very basic, and I am sure you probably know about this, but in case you don't, it's I think it is useful for your exercise. Okay, measuring poverty. I am not discussing here multidimensional measurement. I am discussing here just the very basic strategy to measure poverty from the perspective of income, that is income-based poverty. And you probably, on a daily basis, in your activities, or I don't know, you hear a lot of what is the magnitude of poverty, what is the number of individuals under the poverty line, or the proportion of the population in a given country living in poverty, or that poverty in the developing world just reduced from 40% to 12% over the 2 last decades. So, okay, we will discuss about that, okay? The percentage and the amounts and the number of population in poverty. So, 2 critical steps, and which were devised by Amartya Sen in a very famous paper published in Econometrica in 1976, where he defined a very famous poverty measure, which is called the Sen Index. We won't discuss the whole index during this presentation, but the 2 critical steps for poverty measurement that he formalized axiomatically in that very famous paper, which set the stage for subsequent measures and the measurement that we use nowadays. So the identification, it's quite obvious, but if you review with more detail these two steps in that paper, you will have a sense of some specific properties that these poverty indices should met. So, but let's keep it in the basics. So, the identification stage, Sen says that an individual who will be identified as poor or deprived is the individual whose income is below or at least equal to the value of the poverty line. So this is quite obvious. We all know about this, right? But how to measure poverty? Okay, we need the per capita income, or the income of each individual, or the per capita consumption. And this is an important issue. It seems quite obvious, but sometimes people get confused about the per capita term. It is not about this Y, which represents the income. It is not about the personal income that each individual earns, right? When we measure poverty, we usually consider the total income in the household. A household that is composed by individuals who earn income from the labor market, for individuals who earn income from non-labor sources, which are social transfers or remittances, etc., etc. And it is composed also for individuals who are not working, so they don't receive income, mainly elderly populations and children, right? So for poverty measurement purposes, we require to have the total income in the household, which is the sum of all the incomes earned by the individuals who earn income. And then we will have two possibilities. One, let's call this total T. One possibility is to construct an income in per capita terms, which means the T divided by the household size, which is the number of individuals who are currently living in that house. So if we divide the total amount of income by the total number of individuals, including those who are not working, those who are not earning income, that is children and elderly or non-economically active in populations, we will have this Y of here, which is the per capita income. So that is a standard measure of income, that it's a standard approximation of the income of that household. So even though poverty is usually measured at the level of individual, and that's why we are using the per capita income, our starting point is the household, right? Usually it is the household. Why? Because we have to include all the income earned by the members of that household and distribute those resources among all the individuals living in that household. That's why we obtain and work for poverty measurement with per capita income. So even though this identity is quite obvious and straightforward, how the Y, how the income variable is constructed, it's not quite obvious. And in this regard, often people gets very confused. But there is another possibility, a second possibility, which is not taking the per capita income, but taking equivalence scales. which means the following. On one hand, you have within the household adult population who earn some income, right? And you have men and women, and you have elderly population and children. So, depending on who they are, whether they are adults, whether they are adults, whether they are children, whether they are men or women, and whether they are working or not, they will have different requirements, different needs of income, right? So there are some techniques that, depending on the context, depending on the household structure, they yield some factors which are called equivalence scales, which means that the total income in the household is distributed within the household members not equally, but differently depending on the equivalence factors. So for an individual, for an adult individual who is working, who is male or female, they will have a different factor compared to the factor for a children, right? So a children, what the factors mean? The factors mean that basically, I don't know, a 5-year-old children has some specific weight, some specific height, so therefore these children has different needs in terms of caloric requirements. These children attend school, so he or she requires some schooling materials, etc., etc. There are different needs that make that the amount of income allocated to that individual, it can be dramatically different to the amount of income that an adult will require to satisfy their needs, including the biological needs, right? It's not the amount of calories required for a children are not the same than for an adult or an elderly population. So how to calculate that? Those scales, that's a different story. That's very complex, a very technical process. There are some words, some empirical words, some very famous approaches, so we can share some references. But let's keep it simple, just to say that this income at the individual level can be derived from both a per capita perspective, in which the total amount of income within the household is distributed equally, and a second version, which is distributed according to the needs of each household member. Okay. Once say that, and let's keep it simple, let's say that this is just the per capita option. So actually, in the exercise of the units of this unit that you have to take is we are asking for you to calculate the per capita income, which is this one, the first option, right? So you have to sum up, to add all the incomes with all the individual incomes within the households, and then to express it in per capita terms using the household size, right? So the total amount of income is distributed equally within the household. So we are asking for that. So let's assume that this is the case. So if per capita income for any individual, for a children or an adult or an elderly person, is below or at least equal to the value of the poverty line, we can say that that individual is poor. And of course, if that income is above the poverty line, that individual is, of course, considered as non-poor, right? How we obtain the poverty line? This character, the set here, that it's that's again a completely different story. It's complex, and that's why I think it's a good idea to have a virtual course on poverty measurement, because there is a lot of issues to discuss here. Very, very important issues, very interesting issues. So we will try to move forward that possibility. Okay, so just let's assume that the poverty line it's given, and which is a poverty line is basically the amount of money that you require to purchase a basket, a basic basket of goods and services, right? It's the market price of those goods. So the very basic poverty line, which is the extreme poverty line in terms of income, is that line that is composed for the market price of some specific foods, right? And how are those foods selected to be part of that basket? Okay, that is where the issue of determining the value of a poverty line gets complex. That amount, those goods are the result of a previous analysis of the consumption patterns of the population, the requirements in terms of calories, etc., etc. So those foods represent the amount of calories that individuals require, that individuals need as a minimum to be alive on a daily basis, basically, and those goods are expressed in monetary terms depending on the market value of those foods. So if I am comparing my per capita income with that threshold, with that value of the basket, I can be identified as poor or non-poor depending on if my income is above or below the poverty line. So that is basically that. So as you can say, I think I consumed, I don't know, 20 minutes in explaining this, which is very, very basic, which is quite obvious. We all know about this, but I just spent 20 minutes talking about this why and the poverty line. So I think it is very important to discuss more about the poverty measurement, because it's a very important issue. Okay, so this is for the identification part. So individuals are poor if their income are below or are at least equal to the poverty line, right? And then the second step that Amartya Sen suggested is, okay, we have identified who are the poor. So how can we express those individual figures in terms of a summary indicator for the whole population? That is the aggregation step, and that is the origin of many of the aggregate poverty indices that we know nowadays. The Foster and Greer-Torbeck, the Sen index, the Kakwani index, a lot of indices that we use in this issue. So the very basic measurement, the very basic aggregated index is this one. the H, which stands for headcount, right? Which is nothing more than the proportion of individuals living in poverty within a given population, right? So the Q is the sum of all the individuals identified as poor according to this identity, to this expression. And N is the size of the population. That's the total population of a country, right? So if we divide the total number of poor population by the total population, we will have a share, right? So that is our poverty index, our very basic poverty index. By the way, this was not created by Sen. I mean, Sen discussed these two critical steps and set the stage to derive more complex, not complex, more comprehensive poverty indices, because I mean, indices that are sensitive to different. No, I'm not getting this more complex. Sen just discussed identification and aggregation to set the stage for a discussion of poverty indices that meet some desirable criteria. So we will discuss this in another virtual course. For now, let's keep it with the very, very basic poverty index, which is not proposed by Sen, but actually was used first at the end of the 19th century by Sigmund Rountree here in the UK, who measured for the first time poverty in the city of York. So he used this very basic equation, right? And by the way, he proposed as well, for the first time, this poverty lane, the basic poverty lane, based on the caloric requirements of the population, right? Okay, so this is what you are required to do in the exercise, just to measure poverty. First, to obtain the per capita income, and then to solve poverty, the poverty equation. So to report the share of individuals who are living in poverty. How to measure poverty? Let's imagine that our poverty line is given, it's $120, or pounds or pesos, I don't know, and the total population is 15. So we can have this distribution of incomes. For the 15 individuals and their incomes, we can count how many individuals are in poverty. So, as you probably know, as we saw just recently, according to this identity, we can determine that this first individual is poor because 100 is lower than 120. This one, the second one, is also poor because his or her income is at least the value of the poverty line. This one is also poor. This is poor. These are non-poor. This is poor. This is poor. These two are poor. And this is poor. So how many poor we have? What is the value of our Q? It's 9, right? So 9 divided by 15 individuals, which is the N, the total size of a population, it is 60%. So poverty in this population is 60%. Another possibility, which is very straightforward and very intuitive, especially when you are dealing with many dimensions of poverty. So now we are illustrating the case for income-based poverty, which is the unidimensional approach. But we all agree that poverty is a multidimensional problem, etc., etc. So if we are measuring multidimensional poverty, we we will have first in the rows households and individuals, as in this example, right? And in the columns, we will have this dimension, which is, sorry, this one, which is the income. But we will have more, which is the dimension 2, another column for the dimension 3, another column for the dimension 4, right? So when we are dealing with many dimensions, a very straightforward and simple and very transparent and intuitive approach to measure poverty is to think about this in matrix terms, using just positive entries to this matrix, right? So we already know that this individual is poor. Instead of highlighting this individual as poor and keep a record of the individuals who are poor, we can just simply add into our data set entries, positive entries for the poor population. So this individual is poor? Yes, it's poor. Okay, let's put it 1. This one is poor? Yes, 1. For those who are not poor, let's use a 0 value, right? And at the end, we can just calculate the average of the entries of the matrix. And that would be equivalent to exactly the same share. 60% of the population, like here. I mean, poor population divided by the total population is 60%. If we use positive entries in a matrix, the average of those entries, the average of ones and zeros, will be exactly the same, 60%. So this is again quite obvious, quite simple. You might be asking now, okay, this is for what? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, but when you are dealing with many more dimensions, this technique of positive entries to the matrix makes a lot of sense because facilitates a lot the work. Okay, so that's for today. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, comments, please go ahead. As I said at the beginning, we will be reviewing the measures and the concepts for the taxation and social expenditure during the last webinar on December the 4th, when we will present a complete exercise. And yes, for this, for the activity of this unit, you are required to measure poverty. So it's just the very basic measurement, the same as we just saw. So you know something very basic about poverty measurement, and that is. Thank you very much. Ivan, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you for your presentation, very clear. And I don't know if anyone has a question. I think we are already over the time, but if there's a question, this would be a good moment to raise it. And if not, if we don't have a question, please remember that we will have a final webinar, an extra webinar on the 4th of December. And that webinar is going to be for both tracks, basic and advanced tracks. So you are all invited. We have a question here. What do we do about the income of the cash transfer program that are self-declared on household surveys? That's a very interesting question from Nicolas Pirani. Usually the household, I think, yes, we need to acknowledge there is a sub-reporting problem in household surveys, and but when it depends on how the cash transfer is given to the household. Sometimes the household is receives a fixed amount, and every household receives a fixed amount. So even if if the household reports that they receive the support, then, or the cash transfer, then you know the amount. The problem is when the cash transfer is differentiated by household. For example, in terms of the number of children, or elderly people, or activities, etc. So there are some techniques sometimes, not only for the sub-reporting of cash transfer, but in general for sub-reporting income. And as Eduardo said, this could be one of the topics of discussion in a poverty measurement course that I think is taking some relevance to do it next year. But in some of the academics suggest that we should adjust the income distribution by national accounts, for example. In the national accounts has a part that is the income from the households, and usually there is a mismatch. So in national accounts you have a total amount of household income that is much higher than the total amount of household income reported in income surveys. So some people suggest you could adjust that and then measure income poverty again, and that second measurement of income poverty would be more accurate. In general, what surveys try to do is to have some validation questions. So, for example, if people say, "What is the?" The people applying the questionnaire could ask, "What is your monthly income?" I don't know. People could say $100. Okay, and what are you? So you could take note of that, but maybe that's a sub-report of the real income. So you try to make some validation questions, like, for example, where do you work? And they could say, "Oh, well, I'm a peasant, and then I get a daily payment." "And how much do you get every day by your work?" Almost nothing, like $10. "Okay, and how many days per week do you work?" "I work every single day except on Sundays." Okay, so you work 6 days a week. That's $60 per week. "And how many weeks per month do you work?" 4 weeks. "Oh, in that case you earn not $100 that you said before, but 240. And so that kind of a validation questions to get a little deeper inside how the amount of income people receive is intended to fix the underreporting of incomes, of all kinds of incomes. So there are different techniques, but this is probably a whole subject of another course. I don't know if there's another question.
Yes.
We have a big one here. Cristiano. Okay.
Yeah, I can address it in a few. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Once you finish, Ivan, I don't want to.
You want? Please say.
Okay. Well, I would like to also add to the to the previous question that, yeah, I mean, what Ivan explained, it's I mean, it's a very comprehensive explanation, but and also if you are I mean, for the purpose of implementing the microsimulation or a fiscal incidence analysis, you know, that's why I discussed this this scheme. If you know exactly what are the requirements, and there is no reason for which individual in the target population receives more or less that the rules or the laws establish, you can simply, exactly as Ivan said, there are a lot of techniques, complex techniques, others quite straightforward, but you can simply, as we discussed with the previously with the taxation, you can use simulation or imputation, right? For instance, if I don't know, let's say the minimum wage, which is by mandate of the law, no one in the country can receive less than the minimum wage, right? So you open your data set, you explore the data, and you encounter that some individuals are reporting less than the minimum wage. So in that situation, it is quite straightforward. So you know that they are underreporting for several reasons. That is not an issue to discuss here, right? But for several reasons, they are biasing their declaration. So you know that by mandate of the law, they cannot earn less than the minimum wage. So you can assume that at least they are earning the minimum wage. So you can adjust the difference, right? So you are fixing that on the reporting. So the same logic applies to many fiscal interventions, especially in terms of what you were asking about cash transfers, etc. That is why it's important to be supported from a local team who knows the exact requirements, the amounts, the rules, the laws, etc. Because you can adjust, right? Okay, so I think there are no more questions. I have an additional question to address for Cristiano, which is related to the Unit 3. So probably for this unit, it's there are no more questions. I am assuming that. If there are no more questions, let me address that. If you are not interested in this answer, please do not worry. I can just stay for a few minutes here with Cristiano. I don't know if Ivan Rueda, if you can open the microphone to Cristiano, please. And I don't know, Cristiano, if you speak Spanish, probably is better.
Well, I can speak in English or in Portuguese. I don't know.
Oh, in Portuguese. No, okay, that's fine in English. Thank you, Ivan. Okay, so you mentioned. I have your question here.
Yeah, the point is that both on the document and in the test, there are some the question. For instance, say here, for example, direct cash transfers. So what I understood is that one should always be looking for the liquid effect considering always the direct cash transfers and tax on personal income and contributions, or that is both the sides of the figure that you presented. So not only the direct cash transfers. So I noticed that at least in the document, in this statement you say only about the direct cash transfers, and the same analysis could be done in the quiz, because you say in my last paragraph here, based on a fiscal mobility matrix, blah blah blah, say the negative effects of indirect tax. This one is the correct statement according to the test. Say the negative effect of indirect tax is greater than the positive effect from direct transfers. But from my understanding, one should always be looking for the liquid effect. So you should, maybe it's a question. The correct would be one to say the negative effect of indirect tax and indirect subsidies is greater than the positive effect from direct transfers and direct taxes. I mean, one should always be looking for the liquid effect, not for only one of the side of the figure, for instance. So.
Okay. Cristiano, to be honest.
Yeah, you can look further on that. You don't need to answer me.
No. I would like to address it now because I was about to answer your question the previous week, but to be honest, and I am sorry, I think I'm not sure I am understanding the concept of liquid effect you are mentioning. What do you mean by liquid effect? That's why I couldn't answer your question the previous time, because I don't know what you mean for liquid effect. So let's see. I am looking at the document of Unit 3 now. So the fiscal mobility matrix, the image 1, right?
Okay, let me open the document here. Just a moment, please. So in the Unit 3, let me see where is the just a moment.
Yeah, thank you.
So if you could open the Unit 2 document.
The Unit 2.
Yeah, because it refers, in the Unit 3, they refer to the concept explained in the Unit 1. Oh, sorry, in the Unit 2. So.
Okay.
So what I mean in terms of liquid effect is that can you open on the page 9, please?
Of the document 2?
Yes.
Okay.
So you have a figure 2, right?
Uh-huh.
So what I understand is that one should always be considering both the right side and the left side to move from the market income, for instance, to available income, right?
Okay.
So the liquid effect is the right side and the left side put together, right? So you add conditional and unconditional direct cash transfers and in-kind transfers, and you subtract taxes on personal income and contribution. So this is the liquid effect, and you come to available income. But if you look on the page, on the document 3, let me show on the document 3, page 9, also page 9. Let's see. On page 9, no. On page 9, beginning on the right column. So here, just in the beginning, the table shown below illustrate both cases. For example, direct cash transfers, and you say,
the disposable
direct cash transfers, disposable income, but it's not direct cash transfers. I think the correct would be to say direct cash transfers and taxes on personal income, because direct cash transfers are only one side of the figure 2.
You are completely right. Yes, there is yes, and let me make a parenthesis there. You are completely right, because why? The figure 2, the general structures of income concepts of Unit 2, is the new and definitive construction of incomes in the current framework of the CEQ analysis. Okay, so that's fine. That's right. So you move from market income to disposable income by subtracting taxes on personal income, contribution, and adding the conditional cash transfer.
Yeah.
What happened here is that in this matrix, which was constructed for the case of Costa Rica, at that moment, you moved from market income to another concept called net market income, which subtracted the direct taxes, right?
Okay.
And then you just add the cash transfers, and you obtain the disposable income effect. So in this wording, it is assumed that we already took into account the direct taxes. So that's why in the wording which was took from the document of for Costa Rica, it's referring only to direct cash transfer. So, but that's fine. You are completely right.
Okay, so probably the same will happen in the quiz, because it's also referring to this specific condition of Costa Rica. So I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the explanation.
No, thank you very much. That's why I mean I did understand. I did understand your question, but what I didn't get was the content, because I didn't know. I didn't know what was the issue, but now it's very clear, and you're completely right. So
okay. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm so sorry, Ivanes, David, Olga, for this time, and the rest of the participants. I just wanted to address this question now, because I needed to hear from Cristiano. Thank you very much to all you. We'll see you. We'll meet on December the 4th. Thank you very much.